12,000 B-17 flying fortresses were built, and they dropped approximately 640,000 tons of bombs.
To many, the B-17 flying fortress represents the brute strength and resilience of Allied air power in World War II, with its iconic silhouette and an arsenal of machine guns bristling from every angle. It looked every bit the unstoppable giant of the skies. But behind the legend lies a darker, grimmer reality. For the 10 men who climbed aboard each mission, flying the B-17 was anything but glorious. It was a gamble with death at 25,000 feet. Missions were cold, brutal, and terrifying, often ending in flames or silence. Despite its rugged design and fearsome reputation, life inside a B-17 was a relentless trial of courage, endurance, and sacrifice. This is the story of the men who flew them, and the hell they flew through. At 18,000 feet, the sky may look calm, but inside a B-17, it was a freezing, oxygen-starved nightmare. The aircraft was unpressurized and unheated, exposing crews to temperatures as low as -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Every man wore an oxygen mask just to stay conscious, and relied on bulky, electrically heated flight suits to ward off frostbite. If the suit failed, which they often did, numbness set in quickly, and bare skin could freeze to the metal. Blood from even minor wounds could crystallize mid-air. Oxygen failure was swift and deadly. Without warning, a man might slump over unconscious, dying in minutes unless someone noticed. In this frigid, high-altitude coffin, crew members endured hours of physical torment before they even saw the enemy. Before the flak and the fighters came, they were already battling nature itself. The B-17's best defense wasn't armor. It was numbers. Tight formations allowed bombers to create overlapping fields of machine gun fire, a moving fortress in the sky. But forming those deadly boxes wasn't easy. Dozens of aircraft had to take off in rapid succession, every 30 seconds, then climb, level off, and assemble in exact patterns, often in poor weather with limited visibility. Mid-air collisions were common. Just learning to fly in formation was so dangerous that nearly 2,800 airmen died in training alone. For many crews, the scariest part of a mission wasn't enemy fire. It was simply getting into formation without crashing. Once formed up, they were safer, but the sky was still full of hazards, and every second burned fuel, froze flesh, and edged them closer to enemy territory. Before they even saw enemy fighters, B-17 crews had to survive the flak, Germany's fearsome anti-aircraft artillery. The most infamous of these was the 88mm flak cannon, capable of launching shells high into the thin air where bombers cruised. These shells didn't need to score a direct hit. Timed to explode at altitude, they scattered clouds of razor-sharp shrapnel, ripping through aluminum skins and flesh alike. Even a near miss could take out an engine, blow open a fuselage, or shred control cables. Worse still, flak was often concentrated over key industrial targets, turning bombing runs into death corridors. If flak was the first trial, German fighters were the executioners. Alerted by radar, Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled to intercept bomber formations after they passed through flak defences. Fast, aggressive, and well-armed, aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 tore into the B-17s from all angles, head-on, from the sides, and especially from the rear. They knew the bombers' weak spots and exploited them ruthlessly. The B-17's 13 machine guns gave it teeth, but in truth, they weren't always enough. Early in the war, the bombers were sent deep into enemy territory without long-range escort fighters. Allied planes like the P-47 Thunderbolt could only go so far before turning back, leaving the bombers alone in the most dangerous airspace. German pilots took full advantage. Entire squadrons of B-17s were shot down before ever reaching their targets. It wasn't until the introduction of the P-51 Mustang, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Germany and back, that losses began to drop. Until then, B-17 crews lived with the gutting knowledge there would be no help when the fighters came. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10 young men, most of them barely out of high school. Packed into a narrow aluminum frame with little room to move, they worked in perfect synchronization, each job vital to survival. At the front sat the pilot and co-pilot, navigating and steering the heavy bomber under constant stress. Just below them, the bombardier and navigator handled targeting and course plotting. Behind them, the radio operator managed communications, sometimes the only voice that kept a crew connected to the outside world. Then came the gunners. Armed with .50 caliber machine guns, they were the aircraft's last line of defense. Waist gunners, tail gunners, and turret gunners scanned the skies for threats, often firing blind into chaos. All wore bulky gear, oxygen masks, flight suits, flak vests, and carried parachutes clipped to their chests. It was teamwork under fire, and every role carried deadly risk. Of all the crew positions aboard the B-17, the gunners faced the most exposure, the most responsibility, and often the worst conditions. The tail gunner sat isolated in the far rear of the aircraft, perched on what looked like a sawed-off bicycle seat, tasked with protecting the bomber's vulnerable backside. He had the best view of death coming straight at him and almost no room to move. The waist gunners, positioned at open side windows, stood or knelt throughout the mission. There were no seats, no insulation, and no shielding from the biting wind or enemy fire. When German fighters struck from the flanks or made a strafing run, these gunners were the first, and sometimes only, line of defense. Just behind the cockpit was the top turret gunner, manning a rotating dome that offered a 360-degree view. That visibility made him a prime target. As enemy fighters screamed in from above, he had to track, aim, and fire, often while the bomber was shaking violently from flak hits or evasive maneuvers. Their job was to protect the crew, but in truth, there was no truly safe place on board. Perhaps the most feared position aboard the B-17 was the ball turret gunner, a young man curled inside a glass sphere mounted on the belly of the aircraft. Cramped, isolated, and suspended in space, the ball turret was a lonely outpost between the bomber and oblivion. To climb in, the gunner had to shed his parachute. There simply wasn't room for it. If the turret's hydraulics failed, or if the aircraft took damage, he might never get out. The ball turret was a prime target. Enemy fighters often dove beneath formations to strike from blind spots. The gunner had to rotate the turret with hand and foot controls, track speeding aircraft, and fire twin .50 caliber guns, while the bomber shook and flak burst nearby. Some died without ever seeing what hit them. Others were still alive when the plane went down, trapped inside a sphere too small to escape, burned alive or crushed if the aircraft crash-landed with the turret extended. It was mechanical claustrophobia at 25,000 feet, cold, terrifying, and brutally exposed. For the man inside, every mission felt like being entombed in glass, waiting for the sky to shatter. Near the nose of the B-17, the bombardier and navigator worked in one of the most exposed parts of the aircraft, a glass bubble offering no real protection from gunfire or flak. The bombardier operated the precision Norden bomb sight, guiding the release of thousands of pounds of explosives onto enemy targets. Just above and behind him, the navigator tracked their course across hostile skies, making constant adjustments with maps and instruments while the bomber shuddered under attack. The radio operator, located mid-fuselage, served as the communication lifeline. He sent updates, received orders, and, in emergencies, called for help. At times, he even manned a machine gun. These positions required sharp focus and calm under pressure. A single miscalculation, missed signal, or panicked delay could spell disaster, not just for their plane, but for dozens flying nearby. When a B-17 was hit, chaos followed. Shrapnel from flak or cannon rounds could rip through the fuselage in an instant, puncturing fuel tanks, severing control cables, or tearing through the crew. Sometimes the aircraft remained flyable. If so, the pilot and co-pilot worked frantically to keep her in the air while the crew scrambled to assess the damage, extinguishing fires, helping the wounded, or jettisoning bombs to lighten the load. But more often, a critical hit meant bailout. The intercom would crackle with a brief, terrifying command. Abandon ship. Each man grabbed his parachute, snapped it on, and crawled toward the nearest hatch, often through narrow spaces, over injured crewmates, or past gaping holes in the floor. For some, especially ball turret gunners, escape was impossible if the plane lost power or hydraulics. Others never got the chance. Planes hit in the bomb bay or fuel tanks could erupt mid-air, vanishing in a flash. Entire crews were lost in seconds, their only memorial a puff of smoke drifting high over enemy lines. Survival wasn't guaranteed, even if you made it out. Parachuting over enemy territory brought a whole new set of dangers: capture, drowning, or worse. Bailing out of a crippled B-17 was only the beginning of another nightmare. Parachuting into enemy territory meant near certain capture, if you survived the descent. Many airmen were injured during the jump, landing in forests, rivers, or enemy-held farmland. In Europe, most captured flyers became POWs. Conditions varied, but they faced long internment cold camps and harsh interrogations. In the Pacific, the stakes were even higher. Captured airmen were often tortured or executed outright. Tales of mutilation, starvation, and beheadings made these missions feel like one-way tickets. Some crews disappeared without a trace, their final moments known only to the men who watched their bomber fall from formation. Others bailed out over water, freezing seas, or the vast expanse of the English Channel. Rescue missions were mounted, but time was critical. Hypothermia set in quickly, and many airmen drowned waiting for help that never came. And then there were those who never reached the hatch in time, those trapped by wreckage, unconscious from wounds, or caught in a burning fuselage. Their names were added to the growing roll of the missing, the lost, the silenced. The Flying Fortress gave them a fighting chance, but not always a way home. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a marvel of its time, tough, heavily armed, and capable of delivering devastating payloads deep into enemy territory. But its true strength came not from its metal, but from the men inside it. These were young volunteers who faced fire, ice, and fear with unimaginable courage. They flew into flak storms and fighter attacks knowing the odds, knowing they might never return. Thousands paid the ultimate price, not for glory, but for duty, for their crew, and for the mission. The legend of the B-17 lives on, not just in history books, but in the silent bravery of those who flew them. They weren't just airmen. They were brothers in the sky, forged in fire.